Have you ever considered that for some nations, betrayal isn't a failure of diplomacy, but the actual foundation of their survival? This document completely shifts the perspective on how nuclear armed states operate in the shadows.
Welcome to Strategic Labs. Like and subscribe for more tactical insights.
Wait, I usually say that part.
Oh, my bad. Go ahead.
Welcome to Strategic Labs. Like and subscribe for more tactical insights, because today you and I we're moving past the polished press conferences.
Right, the sanitized United Nations briefings, all of that.
Exactly. We are stepping directly into this incredibly claustrophobic, high-stakes architecture of global power. We're doing a deep dive into Edward H. Whitmer's 2026 intelligence analysis, Covert Operations Pakistan.
And I want to set the tone right off the bat here. This
Okay.
isn't a discussion about right and wrong.
Yeah, we aren't here to moralize at all.
No, not at all. We are here to deconstruct the raw mechanics of survival in, what is arguably one of the most volatile regions on the planet.
Because it really is an intensely clinical piece of research. I mean, it demands that you completely discard your preconceived notions of how a state functions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because if you consume standard international news, the narrative you usually get about Pakistan is it's one of inherent dysfunction.
Right. It's always portrayed as this riddle wrapped in a crisis. Right?
Exactly. An endlessly collapsing patchwork of political assassinations, economic bailouts, and, fragile civilian governance.
Governance that's constantly at the mercy of military whims.
Yeah. It looks, to the Western observer at least, like a state that is perpetually failing.
But Whitmore's research kind of strips away that veneer, doesn't it?
It does. It reveals something far more complex. The chaos you see on the news is actually not accidental.
Wait, not accidental?
No. It is an engineered, fiercely guarded equilibrium. It's an environment meticulously maintained by an intelligence apparatus.
The Inter-Services Intelligence, right? The ISI.
Yes, the ISI. And they operate entirely without a safety net, believing that a tightly controlled state of internal crisis is, well, it's the only way to prevent total annihilation.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the foundation of that very mindset, because we aren't going to just list off a timeline of treaties today.
No, that's not what we do here.
Right. Our mission today is to extract the top 3 most disruptive strategic doctrines from Whitmore's analysis. And the first one, it completely reframes how we view statecraft.
Yeah, the author calls it the state born from panic, or chaos as governance.
Chaos as governance, which means we need to understand the trauma that actually forged this intelligence apparatus.
Right, and to grasp the mechanics of the ISI today, you have to, physically place yourself in the summer of 1947.
Yeah.
You really have to understand the genesis of the nation.
Because modern nation states usually have a gestation period, right?
Exactly. They have transitional governments, constitutional conventions, a gradual handing over of administrative machinery.
But Pakistan had none of that.
None. It was forged in the absolute bleeding fracture of the British Raj. When the British hastily partitioned the subcontinent into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan, they basically just drew a line on a map.
The Radcliffe Line.
Right, the Radcliffe Line. And they effectively ignited one of the largest and honestly most violent mass migrations in human history.
And when we say mass migration, we aren't talking about organized relocations here.
No, we're talking about overnight, visceral terror.
Millions of people suddenly finding themselves on the quote-unquote wrong side of a newly drawn border.
Exactly. You had up to 15 million people uprooted. The infrastructure was completely overwhelmed.
I read in the text there are documented accounts of refugee trains arriving in Lahore completely silent.
Yes, entirely filled with the dead. The scale of the sectarian violence was just apocalyptic.
It's hard to even conceptualize.
It really is. But parallel to that human tragedy was a complete and utter administrative vacuum.
Right, because when the government in Karachi tried to open its doors, they didn't have central banks.
They didn't have a formalized military command structure at all.
The detail that got me was the civil servants literally using thorns instead of paper clips.
Yes, and writing on the backs of envelopes because they had no stationery. The state was in a free fall from the exact moment of its birth.
So if you are a military officer or, an intelligence operative in that environment, your operational baseline isn't how do we build a flourishing democracy?
Definitely not. Your baseline is how do we stop the bleeding before the patient dies on the table?
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense.
Precisely. And in a crucible like that, transparency is viewed as a deadly luxury.
Because if you are a nascent, incredibly fragile leadership, Open debate and democratic processes just look like vulnerabilities.
Yeah, vulnerabilities that hostile forces can exploit. So survival demanded an immediate, ruthless monopolization of information and power.
And the military was the only institution with any semblance of organized cohesion.
Exactly, they stepped into the void. And its intelligence wing didn't just become a tool to monitor external threats.
It became the central nervous system of the state itself.
Exactly.
But wait, let me jump in here, because my understanding of an intelligence agency like the CIA in the US or MI6 in the UK is that it serves at the pleasure of the executive branch.
Right.
It
Government.
is a tool wielded by the elected government, but you are saying the dynamic was inverted here from day one.
Was entirely inverted, yeah, out of perceived necessity.
How so?
Well, the military establishment looked at the civilian politicians who were just drowning in the logistics of the refugee crisis and, factional infighting.
And they just decided they couldn't handle it.
They concluded that civilian governance was simply too weak to hold the geographic puzzle together.
Wow.
So the ISI began to embed itself into the core of political policymaking. They weren't just gathering signals intelligence on India.
They were aggressively managing the internal body politic.
Yeah, they were vetting ministers, they were shaping the domestic media landscape.
So they were essentially deciding the parameters of what the civilian government was even allowed to do.
Basically, yes. And this wasn't just a temporary emergency measure. It became completely institutionalized.
Right, and Whitmore points to 1971 as the moment this mindset was permanently hardwired into the Pakistani deep state.
Yes, the secession of East Pakistan, which resulted in the creation of Bangladesh. What's fascinating here is the psychological mechanism of that loss.
Yeah, break that down for us.
You have to remember the bizarre geographical reality of early Pakistan. West Pakistan and East Pakistan were separated by 1,000 miles of hostile Indian territory.
1,000 miles, that's absurd.
It was. They were divided by language, culture, and economics, united only by religion.
So when political grievances in the East finally boiled over,
Right, and the Bengali nationalist movement won the democratic elections, the military establishment in West Pakistan just refused to hand over power.
and the resulting brutal military crackdown led to a civil war, massive refugee outflows, and eventually a devastating war with India.
A war that ended with the surrender of over 90,000 Pakistani troops.
90,000. That is an unimaginable humiliation for a military that views itself as the sole guarantor of the state's existence.
It wasn't just a military defeat, honestly. It was an ideological shattering. Half the country was just gone.
Right.
For the ISI and the military high command, the lesson they extracted from 1971 was not, we should have respected the democratic mandate.
I'm guessing it was the exact opposite.
It was. The lesson they internalized was any political autonomy, any decentralization, any unvetted populist movement inevitably leads to national dismemberment.
So the trauma of 1971 cemented this absolute conviction that if the ISI ever relinquishes its hidden grip on the steering wheel, the state will balkanize and cease to exist.
Precisely.
Okay, but I have to push back on the mechanics of that logic.
Sure.
Let's say you are the architect of this system. You build this fortress from the inside out.
Right.
You centralize all power in the shadows, you manipulate the courts, you engineer the rise and fall of prime ministers to ensure nobody gets too powerful.
Yeah, they do all of that.
You do all of this to prevent the chaos of 1947 or the division of 1971. But haven't you just built a trap?
A trap. How do you mean?
By centralizing power to forcefully prevent chaos, don't you just institutionalize paranoia? Like, if the intelligence agency treats its own citizens and its own elected leaders as potential existential threats, the country is just in a permanent autoimmune crisis. It's attacking its own organs.
That is an excellent way to frame it. And it perfectly aligns with Whitmore's analysis, actually.
Really?
Yeah, it is an autoimmune disorder, but from the ISI's perspective, it is a necessary treatment.
Unnecessary treatment for a patient they're making sick.
Exactly. They use a tactic the book describes as the controlled release of selective information.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
They don't just censor the media, they actively curate it. They manage internal dissent by perpetually modulating the public sphere.
So if a civilian politician starts demanding too much oversight over the military budget,
Suddenly, quote-unquote leaks will appear in the press about that politician's corruption.
oh, wow.
Or reports of an imminent threat on the eastern border will dominate the airwaves, forcing the nation to rally behind the military.
So they are effectively running psychological operations on their own populace.
Yes.
They treat domestic politics like a covert operation in a hostile theater.
Exactly right. They manufacture a highly calibrated narrative where the military and the intelligence services are the solitary titans holding up the sky.
And if you question them or if you demand transparency, you are risking the collapse of the sky itself.
Yep. And the tragic result is that this prevents the development of robust, resilient civilian institutions.
Because the civilian leaders know the rules of the game.
They do. Acquiescence to the shadow establishment is literally the price of political survival.
Real resistance means you will be marginalized, exiled, or worse.
The system keeps the state from dying, but it deliberately prevents it from ever truly healing.
Which brings us to a massive, highly dangerous pivot.
Yeah, let's get into it.
If survival at home requires this level of systemic deception, this institutionalized paranoia, what happens when that exact same doctrine is projected outward onto the international stage?
It gets messy.
What happens when you take this playbook where betrayal is just a management tool and you run it against global superpowers?
That moves us into our second disruptive doctrine, strategic depth through weaponized betrayal.
And this is where the geopolitics become incredibly intricate.
Extremely.
Weaponized betrayal. That phrase really anchors this section because we are moving into the concept of the double game.
Right, specifically looking at the deeply fraught, high-stakes relationship between the CIA and the ISI over the last couple of decades.
Particularly during the global war on terror.
Exactly. Because on paper, these two agencies were allies.
The U.S. flooded Pakistan with billions in military aid.
And in return, Pakistan was supposed to be the staging ground and the intelligence partner for hunting down al-Qaeda and the Taliban.
Yes, on paper being the operative phrase there.
Yeah, right. The reality, as Whitmore meticulously documents, was a partnership built entirely on mutual suspicion and competing core objectives.
Because the CIA brought unparalleled technical assets to the table, right?
Oh yeah. Satellite surveillance, drone networks, signals intelligence capabilities.
But they were fundamentally blind on the ground.
Completely. They didn't speak the tribal dialects. They didn't understand the incredibly complex patronage networks of the Pashtun tribal belt.
And they couldn't physically infiltrate the mountainous border regions.
So they desperately needed the ISI's human intelligence networks.
But the ISI was operating under deeply contradictory mandates.
Yeah, they were.
And this is where I want to get into the how. How does a junior partner in an intelligence sharing agreement actively sabotage the senior partner without getting cut off?
It's an elaborate dance.
The text mentions instances where the ISI would hunt specific al-Qaeda operatives relentlessly, handing them over to the Americans to prove their loyalty.
But then, entirely different operations targeting specific Taliban factions would suddenly hit a brick wall.
Exactly. Why? How?
It is a masterclass in bureaucratic obstruction and plausible deniability.
Give me an example from the text.
Okay, let's say the CIA intersects chatter indicating a high-level militant meeting in Waziristan.
Okay.
They need the ISI to verify the location and provide a ground cordon for a strike.
So they call up their contacts at the ISI.
Right. But the ISI officer doesn't say no. Saying no would expose the game.
So what do?
Instead, they demand more time. They cite the risk of civilian casualties that could, trigger a massive tribal uprising.
Bureaucratic red tape.
Exactly.
Yep.
They require further corroboration from field assets who are suddenly mysteriously unreachable.
And while this bureaucratic clock is deliberately being run down,
Someone completely untraceable drops a burner phone in a local bazaar with a message, and the target evaporates into the mountains.
wow. By the time the ISI gives the CIA the green light, the compound is empty.
Exactly.
And the CIA knows they're being played, right? They know the target was tipped off.
Oh, absolutely they know.
But why? This is the crucial question for you, the listener. Why would Pakistan harbor or protect the very militants that are destabilizing the region?
That's a great question.
Are they ideologically aligned with them?
Some individuals within the apparatus certainly are, but structurally, no, it is not about ideology.
So what is it about?
It is about cold, calculated geopolitical survival. You have to look at the map through the eyes of the generals in Rawalpindi.
Pakistan's primary overarching existential obsession is India.
Yes, India has a massively larger economy, a much larger conventional military, and a significantly larger population.
Pakistan knows it cannot win a prolonged conventional war against India.
Never.
So how do they project power against an adversary they can't meet on an open battlefield?
They use proxies. They cultivate and manage militant groups, non-state actors, as asymmetrical weapons.
So the ISI views these proxy groups not simply as terrorists.
No, they view them as vital strategic buffers and instruments of foreign policy.
Right, they use them to tie down hundreds of thousands of Indian troops in Kashmir through low-intensity conflict.
Exactly. And in Afghanistan, they view a friendly, or at least compliant government in Kabul as essential, quote-unquote, strategic depth.
Because they were terrified that if a pro-Indian government took root in Afghanistan,
Pakistan would be strategically encircled, India on the east, an Indian ally on the west.
okay, that makes sense of the motive. To the U.S., the Taliban were the enemy harboring al-Qaeda.
But to the ISI, the Taliban were the only reliable bulwark against Indian influence in Afghanistan.
It's a complete misalignment of grand strategy.
Completely. And this is where the concept of strategic ambiguity becomes paramount.
Because betrayal in this framework isn't a glitch in their system.
No, it is a deliberately engineered feature. The ISI survives by maintaining fluid alliances, sending contradictory signals, and ensuring absolute plausible deniability.
They never fully align with anyone.
Never. They take American money while protecting American targets.
They court Chinese infrastructure investment while ensuring the Chinese never gain too much leverage.
Right. They keep every major global player permanently off balance, ensuring that no one can ever fully corner them.
Because no one knows exactly where their true red lines are.
Precisely.
But you can't walk a tightrope like that forever without slipping.
Eventually, gravity wins.
And Whitmore dedicates a significant portion of the analysis to the moment the tightrope snapped.
Operation Neptune Spear.
The Abbottabad raid, the night the United States Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden.
That event was a systemic shock that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the ISI.
Whitmore's account of the ISI command center that night is riveting.
It really is.
Huh.
I mean, put yourself in that room, you are monitoring the airspace, and suddenly you realize that American stealth helicopters have penetrated deep into your sovereign territory.
They haven't just hit the porous tribal border.
No, they have navigated to Abbottabad, which is a major garrison city, practically the equivalent of West Point or Sandhurst.
They have executed the most wanted man on Earth, gathered his hard drives, and flown out.
And they didn't give the Pakistani military high command a single second of advance notice.
The humiliation must have been absolute.
Total humiliation.
Because the fallout wasn't just a tactical breach, it shattered the entire foundational illusion of the alliance.
Right. The CIA felt massively, historically betrayed by Pakistan's blindness or complicity.
I mean, bin Laden was living a mile away from their premier military academy.
Exactly. And simultaneously, the ISI felt profoundly betrayed by a unilateral American kinetic strike deep inside their borders.
Both sides realized the double game had reached its absolute limit.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How does a system sustain that level of cognitive dissonance?
Wait, that's my line.
Oh, sorry. You do it.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How does a system sustain that level of cognitive dissonance? It's like playing chess where you are secretly moving some of your opponent's pieces too. Eventually, doesn't the board just flip? I mean, a Western observer might assume that after being caught harboring the architect of 9/11, Pakistan would apologize, purge its ranks, and fully align with the West to avoid sanctions.
Right, but they did the exact opposite.
They leaned in.
They absolutely leaned in. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Whitmore details how Pakistan uses cyber warfare, disinformation campaigns, and deepfakes to control this narrative.
Right. The text points out that this raid forced Pakistan to lean even harder into ambiguity.
They realized that traditional alliances with global superpowers were entirely transactional.
They concluded that if the U.S. was willing to violate their sovereignty so blatantly, then American friendship was just as dangerous as American enmity.
Precisely. They escalated their use of ambiguity as a defensive shield.
But the battlefield was changing.
It was. Relying solely on kinetic proxies or diplomatic double talk was becoming too risky in a hyper-connected world.
So they moved the doctrine of weaponized betrayal into the digital domain.
Yes. They don't need to prove their truth. They just need to exhaust their adversaries by layering misinformation over partial truths.
But how does a nation with limited economic resources compete against the intelligence dominance of the U.S. or the cyber capabilities of India?
The answer lies in understanding how modern information warfare works.
Okay, lay it on me.
Pakistan didn't need to build a cyber command that could, hack the Pentagon.
They just needed to perfect the art of cognitive exhaustion.
Exactly. Whitmore details their expansive deployment of bot farms, disinformation campaigns, and AI-driven sentiment analysis.
Let's break that down mechanically. What does it actually mean to use sentiment analysis in covert operations?
Sentiment analysis involves using algorithms to scrape millions of social media posts, news articles, and forum discussions.
To measure the emotional temperature of a target population.
Exactly. Are people angry about a recent election? Are they fearful of an economic downturn?
So the ISI's digital wings map these emotional fractures.
Yes. And once they identify a fracture, say a political protest in a rival nation, they deploy automated bot networks to flood the zone.
With highly curated contradictory information.
They use deepfakes, doctored audio files, and plausible alternative narratives.
So they aren't trying to convince the adversary of a specific lie?
No, not at all. They're trying to destroy the adversary's ability to recognize the truth altogether.
Wow. It is the weaponization of epistemological doubt.
Right, because if India or the U.S. accuses Pakistan of a covert action, Pakistan's digital apparatus immediately seeds 10 different highly plausible counter-narratives into the global information ecosystem.
Was it a false flag operation by Ra?
Was it a rogue splinter cell?
Was the evidence fabricated by Western intelligence?
Exactly. And by the time foreign intelligence analysts sift through the digital fog to find the origin of the attack,
The news cycle has moved on, and the political will to retaliate has evaporated.
it's algorithmic exhaustion.
As a listener, think about how exhausting it is just to scroll through your social media feed during a contentious election. Oh, it's terrible.
Trying to figure out what's real, what's a bot, what's propaganda, you eventually just tune out.
And the ISI has scaled that feeling up to a geopolitical level.
If an enemy state is spending 80% of its energy just trying to discern what is reality and what is a fabrication, they are paralyzed.
They can't flip the board because they can't even see where the pieces are.
It is an incredibly cost-effective way to neutralize a superior adversary.
But it requires maintaining an environment of constant high-stress ambiguity.
Which is exhausting for them too, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. And speaking of high-stress environments, we must examine the ultimate backstop of all this strategy.
Yes, let's move to our third disruptive point, which, frankly, is the most terrifying section of Whitmore's analysis.
The nuclear knife edge and preemptive logic.
We are moving from the digital fog right into the darkest realities of hard power.
And this section systematically dismantles any comforting illusions we might harbor about the fail-safes of global nuclear security. Because we tend to think of nuclear arsenals as static, heavily guarded silos managed by calm technocrats.
Whitmore shatters that image entirely.
He does it by dropping us right into the middle of an active crisis scenario. It reads like a sequence from a geopolitical thriller, but it's a structural reality.
Let's paint the picture based on the text.
Right. It's the ISI command center. The air is thick, the lighting is dim.
There's a digital countdown clock pulsing on the main display.
Analysts are glued to flickering screens, monitoring a deluge of raw data drone feeds, satellite thermal imaging, signal intercepts.
The tension is absolute because they have just received a fragmented, encrypted intercept from a deep cover operative.
An operative working in the lawless tribal regions near the Afghan border.
Exactly. And the intelligence suggests an unmarked convoy is moving under the cover of a massive storm system.
And the communication is laced with specific, evasive code words. Whitmore highlights the exact terminology intercepted.
Scarlet, Ghost, and Eagle.
And to compound the nightmare, the cyber units in the next room are simultaneously detecting aggressive probes.
Highly sophisticated attempts to infiltrate Pakistan's critical digital infrastructure.
It isn't an isolated incident. It's a synchronized, multi-domain anomaly.
This is the ultimate crisis of ambiguity. The officers in that room are facing an undefined, potentially existential threat.
Right. Is Scarlet a rogue militant faction moving stolen radiological material?
Is Ghost a reference to a foreign intelligence agency, perhaps Israel's Mossad or India's Ra, attempting a sabotage operation against a nuclear facility?
Or is it a massive deception operation designed to gauge Pakistan's response time?
They just don't know. And the dilemma they face is agonizing.
What are their options? Do they pick up the red phone and involve the CIA?
If they do that, they risk exposing their own deeply guarded nuclear vulnerabilities,
Practically inviting the Americans to come in and secure the arsenal.
which the ISI views as an unacceptable loss of sovereignty.
Okay, option 2. They dispatch their own elite covert strike teams to hit the convoy unilaterally.
But if the intelligence is wrong and they end up killing friendly assets or triggering a massive firefight on the border, they risk sparking a wider conflict.
Option 3. They wait. They hold their fire, deploy surveillance drones, and gather more data.
But if the threat is real, waiting could result in a catastrophic breach of their nuclear arsenal.
The material could cross the border and vanish into the black market forever.
And waiting is the one thing their entire institutional history, the trauma of 1947, the loss of 1971, screams at them never to do.
This is the crux of the third doctrine. Whitmore explains the shift from a defensive, reactive intelligence posture to a highly aggressive, preemptive logic.
You have to understand the mathematics of their fear.
The mathematics of fear. Explain that.
Because Pakistan is massively outmatched in conventional military strength by India, they know they cannot afford to absorb a first strike.
Right. If a conventional war breaks out, Indian armored columns could theoretically cut Pakistan in half within days under their cold start doctrine.
Therefore, Pakistan's strategic logic dictates that they must strike first in the shadows to prevent a conventional disaster.
So if the ISI even suspects that RAW, or a proxy group, is staging an operation, their reflex is not to build a defensive wall.
No, their reflex is to disrupt, destabilize, and neutralize the threat at its origin.
Often crossing the line from defensive counterintelligence into outright provocation.
Exactly. It's a terrifying posture when you introduce nuclear weapons into the mix.
Because the paranoia surrounding their nuclear program isn't just a byproduct of this mindset, it's the foundation of it.
Whitmore goes into deep detail about the espionage of acquisition.
How did a relatively poor developing nation manage to build a nuclear bomb in the first place?
They didn't have the indigenous industrial base to do it openly.
They had to acquire what they could not build.
And they had to do it while the entire Western world was trying to stop them.
Whitmore details how the ISI had to deploy operatives across Europe, East Asia, and North America.
They essentially had to steal the foundational elements of their nuclear deterrent piece by piece.
Let's get into the mechanics of that because it's mind-blowing. The text specifically mentions the smuggling of dual-use materials.
We aren't just talking about stealing uranium.
No, we are talking about the intensely specific industrial components required to enrich it. Whitmore mentions miraging steel alloys.
Yes, miraging steel is a crucial detail.
Why is that so important?
It is an ultra-high-strength, low-carbon steel alloy. It is incredibly difficult to manufacture.
And it's used in aerospace engineering.
But crucially, it is required to build the rotors of gas centrifuges for uranium enrichment.
Because those centrifuges spin at supersonic speeds, right?
Exactly, and standard steel would simply tear itself apart under the centrifugal force.
And you can't just buy miraging steel on the open market if you are a sanctioned nation.
So how do you get it?
You build a labyrinth.
Exactly. The ISI and their affiliated networks set up front companies.
Perhaps a textile machinery manufacturer in Switzerland.
Or an automotive parts supplier in Germany.
What?
They create fake end-user certificates.
They purchase the steel, ship it to a transit hub like Dubai, repackage it, disguise the manifest, and ship it to Karachi.
They did the same thing with composite propellants for ballistic missiles and stolen guidance blueprints from academic exchanges.
And the stakes of this operation were absolute.
They knew that a single slip-up, a compromised courier in Geneva, an exposed front company in Frankfurt, or a flipped bank official would result in the exposure of the network,
triggering crippling global sanctions that would strangle the program in its crib.
And that intense vulnerability birthed an environment of absolute ruthless paranoia inside their nuclear establishment.
Particularly around the Wa complex, which is the heart of their munitions and nuclear research.
The counterintelligence protocols there are draconian.
They operate under the constant assumption that the CIA, RAW, or Mossad are actively trying to infiltrate the complex to sabotage it or map it for a preemptive strike.
The text mentions the internal security measures.
Regular, unannounced polygraphs for senior scientists.
Intense psychological profiling of their families.
And swift, merciless purges if an employee is even suspected of unauthorized communication.
It is an environment where trust is viewed as a systemic flaw.
So synthesize that reality. You have a nuclear arsenal built entirely on stolen secrets, fiercely guarded by an intelligence agency that structurally cannot trust anyone.
Not as politicians, not as allies, not even its own scientists.
And this agency operates under a preemptive doctrine that mandates striking first before the enemy even acts.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean?
Tell me.
When I look at all these pieces on the board, the analogy that crystallizes for me is a geopolitical Mexican standoff.
A Mexican standoff.
But it's not happening in a dusty courtyard at high noon. It's taking place in pitch darkness.
That's grim.
You're standing there with your finger hovering over a nuclear trigger, You can hear footsteps circling you.
But you don't know who it is.
Exactly. You don't know if the person next to you is an allied state trying to guide you out, a hostile assassin preparing to strike, or a rogue proxy militant you funded who has now gone completely off script.
Wow.
And your deeply ingrained institutional training tells you that if you wait for the lights to come on to verify the target, you are already dead. You have to shoot at the shadows.
That is a chilling but highly accurate distillation of the environment.
It is.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most critical question of Whitmore's entire analysis.
Which is?
How do you prevent that standoff from ending in mutual nuclear annihilation? If everyone has their finger on the trigger in the dark, why hasn't the gun gone off?
The answer, ironically, is the very concept we've been tracking this entire time.
The ambiguity surrounding Pakistan's nuclear threshold is their greatest deterrent.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. How does not having clear rules prevent a war?
Well, usually in nuclear theory, like during the Cold War, both sides were very clear about what would trigger a launch.
Right. Mutual assured destruction relied on clarity.
Pakistan inverted that logic entirely. Their nuclear doctrine is deliberately shrouded in enigmatic, imprecise wording.
They vehemently refuse to adopt a no-first-use policy, right?
Correct. Furthermore, they deliberately avoid defining exactly what level of conventional attack or what specific type of covert sabotage would trigger a nuclear response.
So there are no clearly painted red lines on the battlefield.
None. And that is by design.
Because there's no transparent signaling, military planners in New Delhi are forced to assume the absolute worst-case scenario at all times.
Exactly. If India suffers a horrific terrorist attack orchestrated by a Pakistan-based proxy group, India's public demands retaliation.
Naturally.
The military planners draw up a response, but they have to ask themselves, if we send a squadron of fighter jets across the border to bomb a militant training camp, is that the red line?
Will the ISI interpret that as an existential threat and launch a tactical battlefield nuclear weapon?
And because they don't know the answer, they are paralyzed.
The uncertainty infinitely complicates the adversary's offensive planning.
It introduces so much risk that full-scale conventional wars are effectively prevented. The risk of apocalyptic miscalculation is simply too high.
But, and this is the tragic bleeding edge of the doctrine, while it successfully prevents an outright declared war, it practically guarantees an eternity of low-level proxy skirmishes.
The shadow war becomes a permanent state of being.
Both sides are perpetually locked in a cycle of testing boundaries, pushing the limits.
Bleeding each other with 1,000 tiny cuts, trying to find where the invisible red line is drawn without accidentally stepping over it.
It's an entire regional order running exclusively on tension.
It is.
Okay, let's take a breath and synthesize the sheer weight of what we've covered today.
There's a lot.
We started by examining the raw trauma of 1947 and 1971.
A historical chaos so profound that it mandated the creation of an intelligence state where secrecy and internal manipulation are the only currencies of survival.
Then we dissected how that state projects this paranoia outward.
Utilizing weaponized betrayal and strategic ambiguity to play global superpowers against each other, turning cognitive exhaustion into a defense mechanism.
And finally, we looked at the terrifying preemptive logic of a nation managing a nuclear arsenal in the dark, using the very threat of unpredictable escalation as its primary shield.
It is a sobering, necessary reflection on how the architecture of hard power operates when stripped of all diplomatic pleasantries.
And here is why this matters to you, the listener. When you read the global news, you are naturally conditioned to look for a coherent narrative.
You want to identify the good guys and the bad guys.
You want to see definitive victories, clear resolutions, and treaties that mean something.
But what this deep dive into Edward Whitmore's analysis shows you is that this framework is entirely obsolete.
It is a comforting fiction. When you observe global affairs, especially in the volatile corridors of South Asia, you aren't watching the truth unfold.
You are watching a highly curated, weaponized narrative.
You are observing a digital and diplomatic fog specifically engineered to obscure reality and exhaust your capacity to understand it.
Which brings us to a final, rather unsettling thought to leave you with.
Oh boy, let's hear it.
We have spent this hour analyzing how Pakistan has successfully utilized human-driven strategic ambiguity to survive against vastly superior conventional forces for decades.
Right.
But as we look toward the horizon, the variables are changing. We must ask, What happens when rogue artificial intelligence and fully autonomous cyber weapons enter this specific arena?
Oh, wow.
If an AI system can generate flawless, undetectable deepfakes in real time, automate the spread of millions of contradictory narratives at light speed, and launch devastating cyber attacks with absolute zero human attribution.
Does it make every nation's covert operations permanently deniable?
Exactly. Are we leaving the era of outright declared warfare entirely?
Are we entering an epoch where traditional military conflict is obsolete, replaced entirely by permanent, invisible, and automated shadow wars where no one ever admits to firing a shot?
A Mexican standoff in the dark? But now the guns are firing themselves, and you can't even prove they exist.
This is just a preview. For the full deep dive, check out our long-form podcast on the channel. See you in